Welcome to Inspiring Business with your host, Mark Bullock, who is the co-founder of videosocials.net and of videointerviewpodcast.com. In every episode, Mark interviews business and organizational thought leaders who share their stories of how they inspire others by making a difference. You can find this show on videosocials.net and YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and almost any podcast platform of your choosing.
Welcome, and today I'm very pleased to have as my guest Aimee Davis. Aimee is the president and founder of Aimee B Davis Law, PC, who is a corporate transactional attorney with more than 3 decades of experience and a number of years of working with us at Practice Marketing through the Phone Blogger service. Wonderful to have you, Aimee. How are you today?
Good. How are you today, Mark?
Good. Well, we know each other for a number of years now, and I've read many of your blog posts, et cetera. But one of the things I always like to start with is we don't necessarily grow up thinking, I want to be an M&A attorney or a corporate attorney or something like that. But so we all have our story of how we landed where we are and what we're doing, and I'd love to hear your story.
Okay, happy to tell you about it. I had graduated from college. I was working as a headhunter for an agency in Lower Manhattan when I was called for jury duty to sit on a grand jury in a murder case. Uh-huh. It was a high-profile murder case that took place in Westchester, as you said, about 30 years ago, where a debutante woman from Michigan had an affair with a teacher that her coworker teacher, and apparently had killed him. And I was, a recent college grad, very eager to sit on this grand jury. So I made myself, I volunteered to be one of the foremen on the grand jury, and, heard the prosecutor's basis for whether or not this woman should be indicted. And I guess it must have been a function of the fact that she was a blonde female that I might have identified with the defendant in the case. And I was somewhat horrified by the sort of, rubber stamp manner in which the grand jury was willing to indict her with such little evidence. Now, I know now that the standard for indictment is significantly lower than would be in a criminal proceeding, but ultimately she was found guilty of murder and was in prison for many, many years. But that moment in time, I guess, inspired me to go and take the LSAT and see whether or not I could get into a law school. And it was all really in the pursuit of understanding, exactly how the legal system worked, understanding a little bit more about justice. Fast forward 30 years, and I'm a corporate transactional attorney having nothing to do with criminal law or any sort of litigation whatsoever. So I definitely took a left turn on that. But that is what inspired me to go pursue an education in the law.
You just never know. It always seems to be just a fascinating, at least to me, it's always a fascinating, process that we go through to ultimately end up where we are. One of the things I think would be valuable to know is, what is the nature of your corporate transactional practice and the type of work you do, and maybe why did you choose that as you progressed in your career?
Okay, so just to circle back, when I was a first-year law student, I started panicking at the idea of being in court and having to, present briefs or just speaking in a courtroom. And there was actually a time I thought about quitting in the middle of law school until I was a third year. And I took a corporate finance class, and I was definitely not good in math, but there was something about corporate finance and sort of the inner workings of how to finance a business that did get me going and really inspired me. So I stuck it out. As a summer associate, I was also interested in trademark and copyright law. So I
Mhm.
worked in a trademark department as a summer associate. But what led me here really was just after my first year as a lawyer, I was doing the origination of securitized loans being made to fast food franchises.
Mhm.
And then about a year into doing that, the attorney that represented one of the borrowers called me a month after the closing of his client's loan to say he had been impressed with the way I, as a junior associate, the way I had handled and run that deal. And I think the reason I was good at what I was doing was because I had been doing it, just those transactions over and over again over the course of that 1 year. And I knew that if I didn't move on and expand sort of the service offerings that I was capable of providing, that I would ultimately be somewhat bored. And I thought what he was suggesting was a really good opportunity for me to get a broader based corporate expertise. And so I took the leap and I went from my first job to a position as a junior associate in a corporate department of a major, full scale law firm in Manhattan. And there I was trained to do the M&A transactions that I still do today, but also some public offering work. And, I worked on a couple of IPOs as a junior associate, but ultimately I shied away from securities work because it's very rule driven and less dynamic than the
Mhm.
transactional work that I prefer. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Because and I think really maybe an example might help people, to kind of understand. So, you had talked about recently that you had a recent closing of a mergers and acquisitions transaction, M&A, and you were representing the sellers of stock, I think.
Yes. Well,
What,
that was
what was
Yeah, let me tell you about that deal.
Sure.
What was very interesting to me was I had really come full circle with respect to this company in particular, because the firm that I was with, that I was just mentioning, my second job, I was an associate having represented the original founders of that company to sell the stock of the company to two employees. So it was a woman-owned business. It was a couple, and a Black-owned business also, which was very unusual because it had been created, I think, in the 1960s, and they were sort of aging out and getting ready to retire. They didn't have any children. They didn't have any heir apparent. So they ultimately decided that to keep the business operational, they would sell it to their employees. So I represented the sellers. And then 20 years later, the buyers came to me. Now they were aging out,
Mm.
and somebody had approached them. A third party was interested in acquiring that business. So now I was selling it for the second time.
Wow.
And I was able to refer back to the original contracts related to the first deal. I, sat and met with the client in his offices to try to help him prepare disclosure schedules related to the purchase agreement that was prepared by the buyer. As I've written in many blogs, that it is typical for the buyer to prepare the first draft of a purchase agreement for stock or assets.
Mhm.
And this transaction was sort of complicated by the fact that the buyer was seeking financing. I think it was an SBA financing to secure the purchase price. So when the lender was ready to go, the buyer was demanding that we close like on a dime. But the problem was that there was a lease in place for the seller's business, and the sellers themselves, those two primary shareholders, were personal guarantors of the leasehold obligations of the business. And so although the buyer really didn't need that particular office space to conduct the business, and so he didn't really care that much about the lease, he was entirely not focused on the fact that the landlord needed to first review his, credit worthiness and determine whether or not this, newly formed business that had no operating history, and the principal, who was young and somewhat inexperienced, whether he could step into the shoes of the existing guarantors and execute a replacement personal guarantee, which would release my clients, the sellers, from their commitment to guarantee the lease. And there was a lot of tension between myself and the buyer's attorney, because she was not reeling in her client. Her client was calling the landlord's attorneys, demanding that they consent promptly, because he was just afraid that he would lose his SBA financing. And I kept, he had permission to call me directly. He was really just edging his own attorney out of the deal and really just trying to steamroll it. He was charismatic, I will give him that. And he was quite a force of nature in terms of making things happen, but he did not ingratiate himself to the landlord's counsel. And I was very concerned that they may end up just getting frustrated and pulling the plug. And my client's lease, by the way, had a provision that said, in the event that the tenant seeks the consent of the landlord to transfer the lease, that the landlord reserved the right to terminate the lease. So the landlord would have been in their, rights to just say, no, we don't like him. We don't want him to take in, but I guess in a post-COVID world, real estate, is a little bit tricky, and landlords have less choice about who's going to occupy their commercial property. And what I was actually thinking, if I needed to defend I couldn't defend the buyer's credit worthiness, but what I could say is that the idea that this lease was going to be assigned really did ensure the ongoing success of this business, and really did, show more like a better likelihood that the rent would be paid for the remainder of the lease, because the selling shareholders were 70 and 88 years of age, respectively. So the young upstart got what he wanted. We were able to successfully close the deal. But as I was saying, I was frustrated with the buyer's attorney, because whenever you have a third-party consent that is required to be obtained in the sale of either a stock or sale of assets, you have what I have written about is a bifurcated signing and closing. So typically, the parties would negotiate the purchase agreement, reach an agreement, sign the purchase agreement. So there's a commitment on the part of the buyer to actually move forward with the closing, subject to the satisfaction of all of the outstanding conditions. And then the seller would go to its landlord and request consent to assign its lease. But here, because the time frame was so compressed, and also because I guess my client had gotten assurances from the representative of the landlord that the consent would be granted, he went out on a limb and asked for the consent and started that process before the agreement was really signed. And the buyer just didn't seem to acknowledge that we had this process in place where it was going to be, we need to sign the agreement and then seek the consent. He wanted everything done simultaneously. It was all sort of, just not customary, very disruptive to everybody's life. And yet again, it was something that I was able to get done. So that's a little bit about what.
Well, and what I hear, Aimee, is that even in something as technical as corporate law, especially in mergers and acquisitions, the financing around that, et cetera, we can't lose sight of the fact that these are human beings. And these are human beings that have their own wants, their own needs, their own agendas, et cetera. And so you, as an attorney in this almost morass of different opinions and ideas and what's supposed to happen and what's traditional and what's customary versus some young gun that really wants to shortcut the whole process, et cetera, and to not have that deal fall apart took something from you, and it took and these types of deals always take something. There's always going to be something, right? That's outside the box. There's always going to be something.
In order to make it happen, I had to do a lot of work that I think customarily would have been done by the buyer's attorney in terms of preparing some of the closing certificates to be signed, some ancillary documentation. I was really doing everything I could to accommodate the time frame presented because I knew that my client really did want to go forward with the transaction, and the last remaining piece was to get this consent. The landlord held us hostage for almost a month. It was very stressful. But you do what you need to do. That is the nature of the corporate transactional attorney.
Well, fantastic. So, and I know too. I mean, this is very educational, and you've made available a number over years of articles on your website we call blogs, we've been working with you. You've been working with us for years now to get those out there. But obviously, you have the intelligence to write these types of things, et cetera. Why did you choose to use Phone Blogger? We're self-sponsored, so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about what Phone Blogger is. But
do you want to describe it before I get into it, or?
Yeah, well, the original concept is that there's somebody that's highly knowledgeable, highly experienced like yourself that when you want to sit down and write out an article that's a few minutes to read, can take hours and hours of your time because you're self-editing and you're trying to self-proof and QA what it is that you're doing. And you don't have anybody else's perspective to know really how this is going to land and what's the best title for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And then there's the whole, okay, well, how do I get it out there? How do I get it posted on my social media accounts, on my website, and my, and put it out into newsletters or email blasts, et cetera, et cetera. So we came up with a concept where we would call an interview, and some of our clients do that. Some of our clients actually prefer to write out the initial draft on their own, but it doesn't need to be perfect. Even if they do that, it doesn't need, and it's by having that ability to work directly with an editor. You're the author. It's your knowledge. It's your expertise.
Right.
And it's your voice. It's your style, et cetera, et cetera. But having others involved that are professional writers and professional editors really brings it to a whole different level. First of all, it dramatically reduces your time required to generate this something that, literally takes a few minutes for somebody to consume that you could spend hours and hours and hours trying to put together. That's the service, and then of course we handle all the technical side of getting it published and newsletters and et cetera.
The technical side of the distribution and the publishing and the promoting of my blog articles to social media is definitely one of my favorite things about the service. I started with Phone Blogger in 2014, I believe, maybe a little later. But I started with the concept of generating content to put forth into the universe 3 years before I had, not 3 years. It took about 3 years before I ultimately had a website online for my firm. So maybe I started, 2014. And the reason was, so as I had said, I came from big law, and now I was launching a solo laptop practice, and I didn't really know what clientele I would be able to, service as a solo in a pre-COVID universe, like working from home in your laptop as a handling sophisticated commercial corporate transactions was not common at that time.
Right.
So I really didn't know how to commit myself to say, okay, these are the service offerings. And I didn't want to put together a website without that sort of confidence or knowledge about what I was there to do.
Right.
But the idea of disseminating information and projecting it out, I thought was a better approach in, around that time, because I was starting to understand that, people were receiving these written articles, and that was a way to establish your validity and establish what services you were providing. So it was really a very organic process. And interestingly enough, when I started writing articles, I was working with a law student who was an intern. I generated the idea, but then asked him to, draft the articles. That was pre-Phone Blogger. And that worked out all right. But of course, then after a certain period of time, he wanted to be paid, because interns do not work for free any longer. And I found the biggest stressor I had was, how am I going to generate content every single month? And what will I run out of ideas, basically?
Right.
But as I started to do it, I let go of a lot of the perfectionism that I was hanging on to. I didn't worry about segmenting my list. I didn't worry about, this article is really going to be I didn't want to anticipate who's going to be interested in reading what article. Is this for prospective clients? Is this for other lawyers that may be able to refer legal work to me?
Right.
I just thought to myself, again, as many eyeballs as I can get on my name, on my website, anybody that's going to click through or find maybe even the title to be, charming or interesting or funny, that's just going to be a value add. But I also found that writing these articles became a real creative outlet for me. And I let go of whether or not I needed to describe legal contracts, the service provided. I started writing things like mentorship, how things about being a business owner, things about how being a business owner made me a better corporate attorney. I wrote about networking and the importance of it, and how to follow through and actually leverage the people that you're meeting, and the importance of follow-up. I mean, it covers the gamut. And I don't think about, is this really an article about the law or the services that I provide? Every once in a while, I will take a step back and say, I haven't written about M&A transactions for a while. So I will go in and I'll have a series of M&A transaction related articles. And
Mhm.
the deal I was just describing earlier is posted in a series of different and related articles over the past several months. And I just have fun with it at this point. But I really do like the aspect of the written word and the ability to, hone in and tighten up what content I'm putting out there.
Well,
But to go back and answer your
yep.
question, phone blogger. I like the accountability. I like the ability to work with an editor. And I also, as I said, like the technical services that are provided. It's just a outsourcing of things I know I could do myself, but it's easier to just trust the people that I work with at your company to take care of some of that stuff for me.
Well, and thank you, and what just to wrap up this component of it, I find for myself, because I've written a few hundred blog articles myself, and we've facilitated, been publishers, QAs, editors, etc. for several, well, probably close to 1,000 professionals over the years, and so there's many thousands of articles that we've facilitated, as it were. But one of the common things that we see, and you just basically laid it out, the whole process, the practice of creating content, helps you refine who you are in your business.
Yes.
And it helps you to see, because you do get some feedback. You do get, I read your article, et cetera, et cetera. So you learn in a we have an official engagement. You learn from others through the feedback, through the editor, through the reader or the viewer or the consumer of the content. What are their needs? What do they want to hear? What do they want to know about, et cetera, et cetera. And as you said, you've shared a lot beyond the law, right? But I did so thank you for being a client for so many years, and we're delighted that we were able to help facilitate you putting this wealth of information that you've got out there on your website and your social media platforms. But I wanted to kind of close with, maybe it sounds like an unusual question, but what do your clients get from you? Because we know what we're going to, I think people can see what they're going to get from you as far as your online content that you're creating. But what are they going to get from you? And I kind of know the answer to the question, which is that you're deep in this. And it in addition to it not only being that those human beings that have their own agendas and desires, et cetera, but how does that marry in with the very legal and technical components that are required to pull these types of deals together?
Well, so going back to when I was an associate in the big law firms, one of the words that was used to describe me by my colleagues was my tenacity. I'm very organized. I'm very thorough. I'm very proactive in making sure that my transactions get done in a timely manner. I follow up. I think as a solo, what I'm finding also is that my responsiveness is greater than I mean, I am an immediate responder with respect to client content or information or emails. I was always trained in my big law firm practice that you must respond within a 24-hour period. I don't even know that people still adhere to that standard anymore, but to be a good transactional attorney, you really do need that tenacious, driven, sort of aggressive way of plowing through these transactions. Because over the course of my career, what used to take a couple of weeks or maybe a month to get done now can take many, many months. Like the M&A deal I did this year started in January and didn't close until the end of July. So there's a lot of work that goes into these deals. And what my clients specifically, what I've come to understand, right, is that even though I'm dealing with corporate executives that are highly educated, they may have MBAs, they may be CFOs, CEOs, presidents of companies, they don't have the training and the expertise in the legal jargon, the legal language. I mean, M&A is its own language. And so what I bring to the table is the training and expertise to help these executives to finesse their way through these types of transactions by dealing with all the legal stuff, dealing with all the due diligence, and they can focus on other things, right? Like running their businesses or taking care of financial things that are going on at the same time in the context of a major deal. But I'm really here to help my clients finesse their way through what is, very complicated corporate legal contracts generally.
And with a smile. So, Aimee, really fascinating. Your journey and what it is that you do, and it never ceases to amaze me that somebody, when somebody can, as you have, really invest yourself in and embed yourself and to always have the goal in mind of getting the deal done, having the parties get what they need, and have it happen. It takes a level of commitment. Mm-hmm. And I think if I was to pull something that from myself, is the biggest takeaway is that you have that commitment, and like I said, being organized, being tenacious, it's what it takes. It is a very complex corporate world that we live in now, or the corporate world. Corporate transactions like this are enormously complex. So the parties involved have no choice, I think, than to have, like in this case, like an M&A attorney. Mm-hmm. But it's important to realize that who they select to be that attorney is incredibly important, because it's not just a transaction. These are human beings that are, interacting with, transitioning from one entity or one ownership or one way of operating to different parties and to different things. And so I can only imagine that those that do work with you really appreciate the fact that you can guide them through that technical process and not knock them over the head, but hold them accountable to get done what needs to get done to actually to get the outcomes that they're looking for. So, mm-hmm. Aimee, real pleasure today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate, and thank you for the many years of great service at Phone Blocker.
Well, and thank you. And one of the things I neglected to do, because I got caught up in our conversation, is your website is aimeebdavis.com. You're on LinkedIn at Aimee B Davis. Now, Aimee is AIMEE. Okay. You have a LinkedIn business. You have Facebook. You're on Twitter, X, etc. There'll be links connected with the podcast here, folks. So you don't have to memorize any of that. But real pleasure, Aimee, and thank you again for allowing us to serve you in creating your content, and as well as really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Inspiring Business with your host, Mark Bullock. Your positive comments, likes, and most importantly, your sharing of this show with others is greatly appreciated. Don't forget to subscribe to the Inspiring Business Podcast on whatever platform you prefer. You can catch prior episodes on videosocials.net and on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and all the major podcast platforms.